Welcome to Sleep Stories. Tonight we invite you to drift away into the soft, winding world of dreams with a gentle tale designed to soothe restless minds. Let go of the day's weight as we step together into the 1,000 steps of Windfern Hallow, a slow, wandering story told in a soft voice, perfect for sleep. This is a journey with no rush and no destination, just gentle discoveries, quiet magic, and peaceful paths under a lavender sky. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and allow your thoughts to float like leaves on still water. Take a deep breath in and out. Now let's begin. Part 1. The Gate Beneath the Lichen. Leora did not know why her feet led her to the edge of Windfern Hollow that evening, only that the breeze was the kind that tugged on curiosity and whispered of soft surprises. She wore a shawl the color of starlight on water, an old thing embroidered with sleepy runes and silvered moths. Her boots, worn and quiet, made hardly a sound on the moss-lined trail as she walked with no clear purpose, no destination in mind. That was, of course, the best way to find something you didn't know you were looking for. The path before her curved lazily between elder trees whose limbs stretched wide like yawning arms. Ivy clung to bark as if trying to remember old stories. Above, the sky had the soft hue of twilight lavender, and the first stars were blinking awake, groggy and slow. Soon Leora came to an archway, small, crooked, and draped in heavy lichen like an old shawl forgotten by time. Beneath it stood a low wooden gate, its hinges rusted, its handle shaped like a sleeping squirrel. She paused, ran her fingers along the cool wood, and then pushed it open with a sighing creak. She stepped through. The world beyond was quieter, as though someone had taken a deep breath and decided to hold it for a while. Lanterns, barely lit, dangled from curling iron posts. Each one flickered to life not at once, but reluctantly, like someone rising from a nap. And so began her wandering. The path led her into hollows and over gentle hills. At one turn, she found a fallen tree that had grown tired of standing. Moss covered its back like a blanket, and mushrooms sprouted like forgotten thoughts. A cat with 3 eyes blinked at her from beneath the roots, then vanished with no particular hurry. She passed a garden of wind chimes. No one was there to tend it, but the chimes rang softly in the hush, responding to a breeze that seemed to sing more than blow. Each chime made a different note: tea kettles, memory, rain on canvas, the sigh of pages turning. Farther still, she came upon a stairway made of river stones, each step uneven and warm beneath her boots. It climbed lazily, almost forgetting its own direction, until it reached a ledge overlooking a sleeping valley, blanketed in lavender mist. She sat there for a while, saying nothing, watching the mist curl and shift like dreams in conversation. And when the moon rose, round and drowsy, Leora stood, brushed off her shawl, and wandered down the next path, lantern light guiding her gently forward. Part 2. The Lantern Keeper's Rest. The path curled like a ribbon through the hush of evening, and Leora followed it with a soft steadiness. The lanterns that lit her way flickered now in rhythm with her steps, casting delicate shadows that waltzed just behind her heels. She came to a bridge carved from pale stone, weathered and bent like an old spine. Beneath it flowed a stream of whispering water, though there was no wind to stir it. Instead, the current moved as if drawn by memory alone, gliding smooth and slow around polished pebbles that shimmered like starlit sugar. Halfway across the bridge, Leora noticed a figure. An old woman, crooked but glowing softly like a candle behind a curtain, sat on a bench that hadn't been there a moment before. She wore a cloak of patchwork lantern glass, and her eyes held the same color as sleep. "Evening, wanderer," said the woman, her voice warm like tea left on a windowsill. "Not many take this path on purpose." "I didn't mean to," Leora replied, sitting beside her, "but I'm glad I did." The woman chuckled. "That's the way of it. Some call me the Lantern Keeper. I light the paths that don't know where they're going yet." From the folds of her cloak, she pulled a little lantern no larger than an egg and placed it in Leora's hand. "This one's for you. It only shines when you forget where you're headed." Leora held it close. It gave off a dim, silvery glow, faint but certain, like hope after a long nap. "Do the paths always lead somewhere?" Leora asked. The lantern keeper shook her head, her eyes creasing like folded maps. "No, Some just lead deeper into the quiet. Leora nodded and stood. The woman didn't say goodbye, and neither did she. The moment simply folded closed behind her, like a page turned gently by the breeze. The path dipped now, curling through an orchard of trees with bark like velvet and leaves shaped like teardrops. Fruit, the color of moonlight, hung low on the branches, but none fell. They didn't need to. Somewhere among the trees, a creature hummed, a slow, looping melody with no end or beginning. Leora paused to listen, eyes half-lidded, swaying ever so slightly to the tune. It sounded like lullabies told by wind to tall grass, the kind you remember only after waking. A little farther on, she found a low wall made entirely of old books stacked spine out. Most had no titles, just soft scuffs, gentle cracks, and the scent of stories long slept through. Leora reached out, ran her fingers along the spines. One vibrated slightly under her touch, and whispered, "You've been here before." She smiled, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Perhaps all places feel familiar in dreams. She sat by the wall and listened for a while to the library of silence. Then, when her breath had grown slow and her heart even softer, she rose again, lantern tucked into her palm, and followed the path into deeper dusk. Part 3. The Market That Waits for No One. The sky above Windfern Hallow had deepened now, not to black, but to that velvety in-between where indigo meets dream. The stars were awake, but not watching, just there, like freckles on the night. Leora's steps led her through a narrow corridor of trees, their trunks bowing inward as if to whisper among themselves. The path widened then and spilled her gently into a clearing lit by paper lanterns that swayed without wind. It was a marketplace, though there were no shouts, no haggling, just quiet stalls set with peculiar things, clock hands frozen at never, bundles of shadowed string, jars labeled "a breath from a mountain top," and one that held, according to its sign, a forgotten word once spoken in kindness. She wandered between them slowly, each step soft as if walking across a cloud. At one stall, a goblin in a blue velvet coat offered her a cup of something steaming. "For tasting memories you've never had," he said, offering her a crooked smile. The drink was warm and honey smooth. As it touched her tongue, she saw a sunlit garden she had never tended, and felt the warmth of a cat that had never slept in her lap. "Lovely," she said. The goblin bowed as if she'd paid in full. Further on, a woman with hair like dandelion fluff sold lullabies on ribbon. Leora watched as a child with eyes like puddles picked one labeled, "For When the Sky is Too Loud." The ribbon played a tune as gentle as mist when the child tucked it behind their ear. At the end of the row stood a stall with no merchant at all, just a table and a sign that read, "Take only what you need." On the table sat a single key, a scarf that smelled of pine and dusk, and a pebble warm to the touch. Leora reached for the pebble. The moment her fingers touched it, she heard a low voice whisper, "For later." She nodded, though to whom, she didn't know. As she moved away, the market faded, not abruptly but slowly, as if it were never quite fully there. The path narrowed again. The lanterns followed. She walked beneath a low arch of willow branches, where the leaves tickled her shoulders like sleepy birds. Somewhere nearby, an owl with no eyes hooted once, then vanished into the hush. The night pressed on around her, not in weight but in warmth. It wrapped her like a cloak and softened the edges of the world. She found a bench shaped like a curled-up fox and sat for a while. The lantern in her palm pulsed once, gently, as if assuring her it was still there. She thought of the pebble, of the drink, of the lullaby ribbon swaying in the breeze. And she smiled. Part 4. The Cloud Stare and the Tea That Floats. When Leora rose from the bench, shaped like a fox, she noticed that her steps no longer sounded at all. Even the crunch of leaves had softened into suggestion. The world had quieted to a point beyond silence, where the hush became its own kind of language. The path turned to mist beneath her feet, and before her stretched a stairway made not of stone or wood but of clouds, stitched together by ribbons of silver breeze. She hesitated, but the lantern in her hand glowed gently, and the pebble in her pocket warmed. So she stepped upward. Each stair gave slightly beneath her foot, but held steady, like walking on memories made soft by time. As she climbed, the stars grew closer, and the air thinned into something less like breath and more like lullaby. At the top of the stair was a garden floating on a platform of fog. Lily pads drifted lazily in the air bearing teacups and cushions. A large teapot hovered at the center, pouring itself into empty cups, which bobbed along quietly until they found a guest. "Ah," said a voice like velvet leaves. "Another traveler." A tall, thin creature, neither human nor animal, emerged from the mist, their eyes the color of unopened letters. They wore robes of layered twilight and had antlers shaped like willow branches. "Welcome to the rest between," they said. "Stay as long as you need, or as long as the tea lasts." Leora nodded and sat cross-legged on a floating cushion. A cup of tea drifted toward her and settled into her hands. It was weightless and warm. When she drank, it tasted like the feeling of something almost remembered, like the smell of your grandmother's attic, or the echo of a melody you once hummed in sleep. Around her, other travelers sat, each one alone but not lonely. A woman with feathers for hair sipped from a thimble. A man who glowed faintly from within stared off at nothing, blinking slowly. A fox in spectacles turned the pages of a book with no words, content with its silence. The antlered host spoke again. "You've made it far. Few wander this far up the hollow without meaning to." "I didn't mean to," Leora said softly, "but I'm glad I did." The host smiled and their antlers glimmered faintly. "That's the hollow's way. She carries you where you're already going, even if you don't know the name of the place." The tea warmed her core. The stars overhead twinkled in slow pulses, as if dreaming. Eventually, when her eyes felt heavy, not from weariness but from softness, she set down the cup, rose to her feet, and nodded thanks. The platform lowered slowly and gently until it brushed the tops of the trees again. The fog stair had changed direction, now descending into the unknown once more. And so she stepped downward, floating toward whatever hush waited below. Part 5, The Library of Forgotten Breezes. The stairway of cloud brought Leora down into a hollow lit not by stars or lanterns, but by soft motes of light that drifted lazily, like dandelion seeds made of glow. She stepped onto ground that felt like moss and velvet and the quiet padding of kitten paws, all at once. Trees surrounded her again, tall, thin, with bark like parchment and leaves that turned like pages in the wind, though there was no wind here. In the distance, nestled at the base of an ancient tree wide enough to house a village, stood a doorway shaped like an open book. From it, a warm golden light spilled across the path. Etched above the arch were the words, "The Library of Forgotten Breezes." Inside, everything smelled of dust and dreams. The walls weren't walls at all, but bookshelves that stretched upward forever. Leora wandered among them, her fingers brushing against titles written in languages that didn't need words. Books whispered softly to themselves. Some glowed faintly, others exhaled the scent of old pine or ocean spray when opened. She passed a table where a badger in a waistcoat was fast asleep with its snout buried in a book titled Clouds That Lost Their Way. A cup of untouched tea cooled beside him. In a corner, she found a ladder that moved on its own, humming quietly as it carried a sleeping fox to a higher shelf. The fox drooled onto the page and didn't wake. Leora stopped at a little alcove labeled Unfinished Whispers. There, thin scrolls of parchment floated in the air, each one twisting slowly. She caught one in her hand, and it read, "She stood in the garden of someone else's memory, unsure whether to touch the roses or let them be." Another read, "The door had been waiting longer than the house had existed." Each whisper was a story that never found its ending. She took a few with her, not in her hands but in her thoughts, and moved on. At the very center of the library sat a reading room shaped like a circle. Cushions were arranged in spiral patterns, and above, the ceiling was glass showing the slow-turning constellations above. A large, gentle creature made entirely of moths rested in the middle, reading silently from a floating book. It looked up and nodded once at Leora, a silent welcome. She sat beside it and read from a book left open on the floor. The pages turned themselves, and though she couldn't remember what she read, it filled her with a sense of deep, echoing calm. For a time, she forgot her name, her path, the reason she walked. There was only the hush of fluttering pages and the pulse of lantern light in her chest. When she finally stood, the library didn't bid her farewell. It simply rearranged itself behind her, placing everything back in the order it had always meant to be. Outside again, Leora found that the breeze had returned. It carried with it the scent of ink, moth wings, and the first note of a lullaby yet to be sung. She followed it. Part 6. The Cottage at the Edge of Never. The wind now had shape, not sharp or cold, but like a woolen shawl gently tugging her forward. It carried Leora through a grove where the trees grew in spirals and their trunks hummed like tuning forks. Beneath her feet, the earth gave slightly, like bread just out of the oven, warm and fragrant with unseen herbs. The path opened to a gentle slope, and beyond it sat a small cottage made of cobbled moonstones and timber that shimmered when it thought no one was watching. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney and disappeared halfway to the sky. A carved wooden sign swung from a post near the door. It read simply, "Stillness." Leora approached and knocked, though the door had already begun to open. It creaked like a sleepy yawn and revealed a room filled with softness cushions of moss, windows made of rippling glass, and a hearth that burned with a fire of quiet blue. An old witch stirred a pot beside the fire. Her robes were layered with time itself, threads of fog and faded candlelight, and she wore a hat made of woven birdsong. A small dragon with translucent wings snored gently on her shoulder. "Well then," said the witch, not looking up, "you took your time." "I didn't know I was coming," Leora said, stepping inside. "No one ever does," replied the witch. "That's the charm of it." She gestured to a rocking chair shaped like a seashell, and Leora sat, the motion beginning immediately, slow and even. "I suppose you're wondering where this path ends," the witch said, sprinkling what looked like crushed stars into her bubbling pot. "I suppose," said Leora, watching shadows dance along the cottage beams. The witch stirred and chuckled softly. Endings are only beginnings in more comfortable shoes. Leora didn't fully understand, but the idea settled into her like a feather in a drawer. "I've been told I'm walking through a dream," she said after a while. The witch nodded. "Not quite, but close enough. You're walking through the soft folds between the wakeful and the wandered, a place full of nearlies and not quites." She ladled a bit of the bubbling brew into a chipped cup and handed it to Leora. "Here, this will taste like rest." Leora drank, and it was true. It tasted like the first full exhale after a long-held breath, like the moment between raindrops on the roof and the first thunder that follows. The dragon blinked one eye open and then closed it again, unbothered. "You'll sleep here for a while," said the witch, already tidying up. "The road ahead needs soft eyes and a quieter heart." Leora tried to speak, but the chair rocked slower and slower until it didn't move at all. Her eyes drifted shut and dreams folded around her like an old quilt. The cottage lights dimmed. The wind paused. And outside, the hollow waited, never impatient, never lost, just gently turning in its own rhythm, like pages turning themselves. Part 7. The Mirror That Forgot to Reflect. Leora woke not with a start, but with the sense that her dreaming had simply changed rooms. The chair had stopped rocking. The hearth was cold, though the cottage was not. The witch and her dragon were gone, but a note carved into a pine cone sat on her lap. "Go when you're ready. You always were." So she stepped outside. The hollow had changed again, as it always did. Now the sky was a soft violet gray, and it hummed with a tune only the trees could sing. The lantern in her hand pulsed once, as if to remind her of something, but not too urgently. The path was always waiting. She wandered through a new thicket now. The trees were wider, flatter, and bore leaves shaped like hands. Some waved gently as she passed. One leaf high above dropped like a feather, brushing her cheek in greeting. The forest opened to a wide glade, and at its center stood a tall, circular frame. A mirror, but not exactly. It shimmered without glass. Instead, it rippled like water waiting to become something else. Its surface showed 1,000 versions of the path behind her, overlapping and vanishing before her eyes could follow them all. She stepped close. One version of herself walked confidently. Another sat by the fox-shaped bench, unmoving. A third had taken the tea and stayed. A fourth never entered the market at all. And then nothing. Just the hollow shimmer, the future untouched. A plaque at the base of the mirror read, "The mirror that forgot to reflect. It remembers instead." Leora reached out her hand but stopped just short of touching the surface. A breeze moved through the glade. The mirror rippled. And then, for a moment, she saw something strange herself, standing where she was now, but older, wiser, maybe a little more weathered. The future self didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply looked at Leora with gentle eyes full of recognition. Then the mirror faded. Leora sat on the soft grass, letting her thoughts settle like dust in a quiet room. She didn't need to understand the reflection. It had already done what it needed to do. After a time, the lantern gave a soft chime. Not a demand, more of a reminder. She rose and continued. Now the trees were hung with silk streamers, and a path of polished stones led her toward a hill that hadn't been there before. At the top of the hill was a door with no house, just a door standing upright, framed in branches and bound with sleepy ivy. No handle, no keyhole, just a painted message. Only dreams may pass. She didn't need to open it. She stepped through, and the hollow reshaped around her once more. Part 8: The Sleep of Stones and Story Roots. When Leora stepped through the freestanding door, the light changed. Not dimmer, just deeper, like the quiet of a room no one has spoken in for years. The air grew heavier, not in weight, but in age. Ancient, peaceful, she could feel it pressing gently around her shoulders, like a shawl woven from lullabies. The path beneath her feet was stone now, broad, flat, smooth as bone. It wound between towering rocks draped in moss, their faces carved with faces too softly weathered to tell if they were ever smiling or frowning. This was the Valley of the Sleepers. But they were not people. Not exactly. These were the old stones. Story roots, they were called by those who remembered such things. They held dreams too long to fit into books, too slow to be told in words. Leora walked carefully. Her lantern dimmed slightly in reverence. Here silence was sacred. Even the wind whispered only to itself. She passed one great boulder, its surface lined with etchings that flickered faintly in the lantern's glow. As she paused, images moved softly across the stone, a tree growing from a cradle, a kettle singing to the stars, a person gently releasing a bird into the sky. The stone was dreaming. Each stone she passed told something different. Some were sad, some were joyous. None rushed, none repeated. Then, at the base of a great cliff wall, she found a stone unlike the others. It pulsed with a faint blue hue, and a small plaque sat before it. Sit and be heard. So Leora sat cross-legged in the shadow of the dreaming stone, her hands in her lap, the lantern beside her, the pebble in her pocket warm against her leg. She didn't speak aloud. She didn't need to. Instead, her thoughts drifted toward a memory of morning bread, the feeling of wool socks in winter, the shape of a hug she'd once forgotten. Little things, safe things. And the stone listened. Lines glowed faintly across its surface, trailing up and around like ivy made of light. A new dream began to take shape, slow and uncertain. It was hers. Not a story, not exactly, but a part of her, made soft, made silent, made visible. When she finally rose, the stone let out a soundless exhale. Not a goodbye, just a thank you. The valley began to lighten slightly. Distantly, chimes rang, thin and uncertain, like a wind just remembering it could dance. She followed the sound. At the end of the stone path stood a single tree, white as cloud milk, branches tipped in gold. From its limbs hung dozens of little bells, each tied with ribbon. As she approached, a breeze stirred, and the bells chimed, not all at once, but gently, each one at its own pace, as though deciding how to remember her. Leora looked up. A small ribbon drifted down, wrapping itself around her wrist. It read, "You've been heard." She nodded and walked on. Part 9: The Moonboat Crossing. The path narrowed as Leora moved beyond the tree of bells. It weaved now through tall grasses that shimmered silver blue under a pearled sky. The stars overhead no longer blinked. They glowed steadily, as if listening, as if waiting. In the distance she heard water, calm, gentle, the kind of water that carried secrets with grace. It wasn't long before she reached it. A great still lake, wide and round, its surface so smooth it reflected the sky like a second dome above the world. At the lake's edge, a dock stretched into the quiet. Upon it waited a boat. not of wood nor metal but of curved white moonlight. It bobbed slightly, though there were no ripples beneath it. Tied to its mast was a ribbon with a single word. Soon. Leora stepped carefully aboard. The boat rocked once like a slow, approving nod, and then began to glide forward of its own accord. There were no oars, no wind, only motion steady and certain. She sat in the center, the lantern in her lap, casting a soft glow over the water. Beneath her, fish swam lazily with trails of stardust for tails. Some had bells tied around their fins, chiming faintly in the silence. Others blinked slowly up at her, their eyes reflecting dreams she hadn't yet had. Halfway across, fog rolled in, not heavy, but thin and glowing. It wrapped the lake like a soft blanket pulled over a dozing child. From within the fog, voices began to drift. Not words, but tones, like lullabies hummed by the moon itself. Then a shape began to appear ahead. An island, small and round, cradled in willows that bowed low to kiss the water. At the center of the island stood a tall post, and atop it, a lantern made of pearl and wind. Its light pulsed with a slow rhythm, like the beating heart of the lake. The moonboat came to a gentle stop at the island's edge. Leora stepped off, the ground beneath her soft and dry despite the water all around. She approached the lantern and placed her own beside it. The pearl lantern dimmed slightly, and Leora's glowed brighter in response, as if greeting an old friend. For a long while, she simply stood there, breathing in the island's hush. The willows rustled, the lake shimmered. A single stone path led from the far side of the island to another shore, faint in the mist. She followed it. The boat didn't follow. It didn't need to. At the end of the path, a dry field waited, covered in soft lavender tufts that swayed without wind. A small sign marked the way forward. The last gentle turn. And with no fear, no urgency, and no destination but wonder, Leora continued. Part 10, the path that curled inward. Leora stepped into the lavender field, the plants brushing her ankles like whispers of stories not yet told. The ground was pillowy soft, with each step releasing the faintest scent of sugar and dusk. Above her, the sky had turned a shade of muted gold, as if dawn had begun, but politely decided to wait. In the distance stood a spiral path, barely visible, except for how it bent the light around it. No signs. No gate. Just a curl of road winding slowly inward, disappearing into a hill that blinked occasionally, as if the hollow itself had an eye open in its dreams. She followed it. The spiral narrowed as she walked. The further in she went, the quieter everything became, until even her thoughts began to slow. Not stop, but stretch. Time moved differently here. It didn't pass so much as yawn. At the center of the spiral was a small pond, flat as glass, ringed with tiny stones that glowed when she neared them. They gave off no heat, no sound, just the sense that they'd been waiting a long time to be noticed. Leora sat at the pond's edge and peered into its depths. She saw not her reflection, but a series of gentle scenes unfolding slowly herself as a child, picking wildflowers in the rain, a kitchen at twilight, filled with warmth and soft conversation, the feel of fresh pages beneath her fingers as she opened a book for the first time. She watched unmoving. The images didn't beg for her attention. They offered it, like a hand extended in welcome, not in urgency. A soft rustle behind her. She turned to see a creature made of moths and memory, its form shifting slightly with every blink. It carried a small scroll tied with a ribbon. It placed the scroll beside her and bowed. Then, without sound, it vanished into the spiral path again, leaving behind a faint scent of chamomile and candle smoke. Leora opened the scroll. It read, "You have wandered well. Now walk inward." She looked around. There was nowhere else to go but into herself. So she lay down beside the pond, the lantern dimmed beside her, and let her thoughts unfurl like threads in a breeze. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't fully awake. She was something in between, a state the Hallow welcomed like an old friend. For what felt like hours or seconds or nothing at all, she breathed slowly. Her chest rose and fell in sync with the pond's surface, as if they had agreed to keep time together. Eventually, the spiral path opened once more, wider this time, leading away, not forward, not backward, but sideways. A different kind of path. And so, with nothing left behind and nothing chasing her, Leora stood, gathered her lantern, and wandered on. Part 11. The House with Too Many Clocks. The path led sideways now, a direction that didn't quite make sense but felt perfectly natural in the hollow. It was like stepping between thoughts, places you didn't know you'd forgotten until you returned to them. Ahead, nestled between two leaning hills, was a small house. Its roof sagged in the middle, like it had sighed too deeply. Ivy clung to the eaves, and its windows glowed faintly, not with light but with time. There were clocks everywhere. They hung from every beam, post, and vine. Some were round and ticking. Others were square and frozen. A few hummed rather than ticked, and one whispered lullabies in a language made entirely of yawns. The door creaked open before she knocked. Inside it was dim, cozy, and filled with the scent of old linen and cinnamon bark. Clocks covered every wall, but none of them agreed on the time. One read 7 past always, another half before maybe. An elderly tortoise sat by the hearth, wearing spectacles and a waistcoat with tiny brass buttons. He looked up and nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting her, but only loosely. "You're just in time," he said, gesturing to a kettle that hadn't started boiling yet, though no one knows what for. Leora sat across from him, her lantern flickering low, casting long shadows that looked older than they were. "I don't seem to be in a hurry," she said. The tortoise smiled, which took a full minute. "Good. Hurry spoils the flavor." He served her tea in a cup shaped like an hourglass. The liquid inside moved gently up and down as if deciding which way to flow. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the tick-tick-tick of hundreds of tiny mismatched moments. The sound should have been chaotic, but somehow it was soothing. It felt like being held by the rhythm of the universe while it dozed. Finally, the tortoise spoke again. Some clocks count forward, some count memories, and others just count soft things, like naps or muffins. Leora sipped her tea, which tasted of hazy recollections and the warmth of being 10 years old. "Which kind are yours?" she asked. He chuckled. "Mine stopped counting years ago. Now it just listens." He tapped his shell gently. A very faint chime echoed back from within. When the tea was finished, Leora rose. The tortoise did not. He simply nodded once more and pulled a blanket of patchwork calendars over his lap. At the door, Leora paused. Dozens of clocks chimed at once, but softly, not loudly. It was like being wished a farewell by moments themselves. She stepped outside. The sky had shifted again. Now it was the color of antique parchment, with lazy clouds shaped like commas drifting above. The hollow hadn't paused, it had waited, and now it opened to her once more. The path stretched ahead, winding through a grove where time, it seemed, had learned how to breathe. Part 12, the meadow where names go to sleep. The grove gave way to open space, a wide meadow stretching far and soft beneath the ever-dreaming sky. The grass here grew in waves, brushing Leora's knees as if to slow her, to ask her to walk a little more gently than usual. The colors were odd, but comforting: pale blues, lavender shadows, faint gold where the light pooled and changed its mind. And woven throughout the meadow, invisible until you were close enough, were names. Floating, written, resting, some etched on stones, others carried in the air itself. Leora stepped carefully. Every few paces, she'd hear one spoken aloud by the breeze. Ameline. Marrow. Thistle. You. She paused. "What is this place?" she whispered. A voice, soft and knowing, answered without body. "This is where names go to sleep when they are too tired to be remembered." Leora's chest rose gently. The idea didn't frighten her. It made sense in the hollow, where nothing truly ended, it only softened. She knelt beside a cluster of flowers shaped like curled letters. One of them bloomed open as she touched it, revealing a name she hadn't heard since childhood, one a friend had once called her, long forgotten but still warm. She smiled. "I remember you." The flower folded slowly again, content. Farther on, a tall post stood in the center of the field, wrapped in vines and etched with dozens of small wooden plaques, each one carved with a single word. Not all were names, some were ideas, emotions, nicknames, or the sound someone made when they laughed. A woven basket sat at the foot of the post, filled with blank plaques and a small carving knife. Leora sat cross-legged beside it. After a while, she took one of the wooden blanks and the knife. Slowly, patiently, she carved a word, not loudly, not deeply, but with enough intention that the Hallow would understand. Drift. She hung it high on the post. As she stood again, the meadow shimmered. The names around her didn't fade or vanish. They grew quieter, curling back into themselves, as if sighing in their sleep. At the far edge of the field, a low wooden bridge arched over a creek that giggled to itself. Fireflies floated just above it, blinking slowly as though bowing politely. She crossed the bridge without a sound. On the other side, a new forest waited. The trees were taller now, with bark like folded cloth and canopies that swayed even without breeze. Before entering, she turned once, looking back at the meadow. The plaque she had hung was already becoming part of it. And the name she had once forgotten now rested in peace, tucked back into her. Part 13. The Forest That Watched with Kindness. The trees beyond the bridge stood tall and close together, but not in an unfriendly way. They leaned in gently, as if they wished to listen to each step Leora took. Their leaves were the color of deep tea, and they rustled not in wind, but in slow agreement. As she entered, the light dimmed, not into darkness, but into comfort, like dusk inside a favorite memory. Every so often, a small light would flicker beside the path, floating just long enough to catch her eye before drifting away. Not quite fireflies, not quite stars, perhaps pieces of thoughts too soft to speak. The forest felt like a place where even secrets came to rest. She passed a tree with dozens of tiny wooden drawers embedded in its bark. Each drawer had a small brass handle and a hand-painted label. A moment of clarity. A near-forgotten kindness. The last breath before a giggle. One drawer was open and a gentle breeze flowed out, carrying the scent of fresh rain on old stone. She closed it with a smile, letting it sleep again. Farther in, she came to a ring of tall stones circling a hollow stump. Resting on the stump was a book without pages. Its cover was blank, but when Leora touched it, a word appeared. Begin? She opened it. No ink, no writing, just a soft pulse beneath the surface of each blank page, as if they were listening, waiting. Leora sat and leaned the book against her lap. Slowly, the stump beneath her warmed, and the air began to hum with the sound of rustling paper. Not turning, not flipping, just the idea of it, like a library in breath form. The trees around her leaned in closer. She didn't speak aloud. She didn't have to. Instead, her thoughts wandered, as they always did, through memories that weren't quite hers, through images without origins, through feelings without shape. The book accepted all of it. It filled, not with words, but with understanding. After some time, she closed the book. It sighed, the way a bed sighs when someone rises from it. She placed it back on the stump, and as she stood, the forest shimmered, not in approval, but in quiet harmony. Then she noticed the forest had changed. The trees had shifted, not moved, not bent, but rearranged in some subtle way to show her a new path. It opened gently, with dappled light trickling down from far above. Before following it, she bowed slightly, not out of habit, but because it felt right. The forest bowed back. She could feel it. And so, guided once again by stillness and gentle breath, Leora wandered on. Part 14. The Stitcher's Loft. The forest path grew thinner now, winding like thread through tall reeds and curling ivy. The ground had a soft give to it, almost like felt beneath Leora's feet, and with each step she felt a faint warmth, like she was being remembered by the earth itself. As she walked, the canopy above thinned and opened into a clearing where the trees gave way to a peculiar building stitched directly into the landscape. It wasn't built so much as sewn, walls made of quilted bark and patchwork curtains billowing at open windows. Moss formed embroidery along the edges, and mushrooms grew in patterns too intentional to be random. A weathered sign hung by one thread above the door, the Stitcher of Quiet Things. Leora stepped inside without knocking. The interior was layered in color and calm, bolts of fabric stacked high, spools of thread in every hue imaginable, and shelves lined with folded dreams. Each pile shimmered slightly, whispering in faint murmurs. 1,000 stories unspoken, but never forgotten. At the center of it all, bent over a low table, sat the Stitcher. She was not tall nor small. Her skin was stitched from patches of weathered parchment and silk, her eyes two silver thimbles that glowed faintly when she blinked. "You frayed a little," the Stitcher said, without looking up. Leora glanced down. Sure enough, the hem of her shawl was coming undone, and a thread of thought was unraveling at her shoulder. "I hadn't noticed," she said softly. The Stitcher nodded, beckoned her forward, and gestured for her to sit on a stool cushioned with sleep. "That's why I'm here." She pulled out a long, curved needle that shimmered like dew on spider silk, and from her sleeve she drew a thread made of breath and lullaby. No pain, no tug, just the quiet sensation of being gently remembered. As she worked, the Stitcher hummed, low and slow, in a tune with no melody, only comfort. The shawl reformed, stronger and softer than before. The loose thread on her shoulder tucked itself back into place, like it had never wandered. When she was finished, the Stitcher handed Leora a button. It was made of cloudstone and stitched with a single word on the back. "Continue." Leora placed it into the small pocket of her lantern's satchel. It made no sound, but the lantern glowed a little warmer. "Do I owe you anything?" she asked. The Stitcher smiled with her thimble eyes. "Only that you wear what you carry. Let the journey shape you." Leora nodded. Outside again, the light had shifted. The sky overhead was now speckled with faint threads of aurora, like someone had stitched light itself across the horizon. The Hallow, as always, awaited, never impatient, always unfolding. So Leora stepped forward once more, the stitch in her shoulder holding strong, the button in her pocket resting gently. Part 15, The Garden of Leftover Wishes. The path led down a slope wrapped in flowering vines that rustled softly, even though the wind had gone quiet again. Leora followed a trail of faint petals, their edges glowing dimly in twilight tones, colors that didn't exist in any other part of the day. At the bottom of the slope, the world opened into a wide-walled garden. The gate was made of woven twigs and tiny bells, and as she approached, the bells chimed, not loudly, but delicately, like questions that didn't need answers. The sign above the gate read, "Leftover wishes take gently." Leora opened the gate, and it sighed as it swung. Inside, the garden was full, overfull, not chaotic, but undeniably crowded with strange and beautiful things, glass bottles dangling from trellises, paper boats floating in bird baths, half-bloomed dandelions hovering mid-air. Wishes, all of them unfinished, forgotten, or set down gently and never retrieved. A fox in a velvet apron tended to a row of potted candles. They flickered when Leora passed, as though excited to be noticed. The fox gave her a nod and said nothing. She wandered between rows of tiny fountains shaped like cupped hands. Each one poured a steady stream of water, even though the cups never overflowed. Near them, tags fluttered in the breeze. One read, "I wish I had said what I meant." Another, "I wish I had taken the slower road." And another, curled around a pebble, "I wish to be found, but only gently." Leora bent to touch that one. The pebble was warm, just like the one she carried. Farther in, she came upon a bush that bloomed with wind chimes instead of flowers. They rang when she looked at them, each tone a whisper of an old want, something simple, something beautiful, something once felt and left behind. At the center of the garden stood a tree that had never chosen a shape. Its branches curled and arched like question marks, and its bark shimmered with the memory of 1,000 hopes. It held a small wooden box at its base with a single instruction carved into it. "Plant if you must. Not every wish needs to wait." Inside were seeds, some glowing faintly, some dull and gray, all soft and smooth as sleep. Leora chose one, not because she knew what it would grow into, but because something in her had quietly said, yes, that one. She found an empty patch beside the crooked path and placed the seed in the soil. No name, no explanation, just trust. The earth sighed. The garden did not thank her, but it did seem to shift ever so slightly in comfort. When she stepped back through the twig and bell gate, the bells were quiet this time, not because they had nothing left to say, but because she already knew. And so she walked on. The Hallow curved around her again, like a soft page being turned, and ahead another path, another light, another quiet chapter unfolding. Part 16, The Hollow Within the Hollow. The path that followed the garden of leftover wishes was narrower now, made of pale, stepping stones that shimmered faintly like old moonlight caught in dew. It wound downward, deeper than she had expected, below the roots of trees, below the sound of birdsong, into a hush that wasn't empty, just deeply respectful. The hollow had curled inward again. This place was quieter than silence. It didn't hush Leora, it simply invited her to become part of the quiet. The lantern in her hand dimmed further, glowing just enough to let her know it hadn't left her side. Eventually she came to a low arch made of woven bones and driftwood, with soft moss covering the joins. Above it, etched into a hanging tile, were the words, "The Hollow Within." She stepped through, and the world didn't change so much as soften. The air here was thick with stillness, but not in a heavy way. It was the stillness of held breath, of waiting for a soft song to begin. The ground was smooth stone, the color of memories, and it led into a wide chamber with no roof. Trees grew along the edge, their trunks tall and hollowed like ancient flutes. Their breath was the wind here, gentle, low, and musical. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, no taller than Leora's waist. Resting atop it was a mirror, small and circular, held in place by delicate threads of gold that swayed ever so slightly. She approached, expecting to see her face, but instead saw nothing, no reflection, no shimmer, just soft, velvety grayness. She reached toward it. Her fingertips brushed the surface, and it rippled. Then, one by one, images began to form. She saw herself walking, yes, just as she had all along, but beneath each footstep bloomed a small light, invisible to her at the time. She saw the people she'd passed who smiled when she was already gone. She saw how her presence had softened places without trying. She hadn't seen it before, but the hollow had, and it was showing her now, not to explain, but to remind. The mirror pulsed once, then faded. She stepped back, not startled, not sad, just quiet. Around her, the trees let out a long, low breath, and petals fell from branches she hadn't noticed were flowering. The hollow within had listened to her without asking and responded without words. On the far side of the chamber, a small path opened between the roots. Leora followed it, brushing her fingers along the trunk as she passed. It was warm, slow, and steady like a sleeping animal. She emerged into a wide glen dusted in soft purple leaves. They fluttered down like lazy snow, curling gently in the air. At the center was a resting place, a circle of woven grass, shaped like a nest big enough for one wandering heart. She lay down. No dreams came, no thoughts pushed, only quiet. The hollow curled around her. And she rested, not because she was tired, but because it was time. Part 17, The Door That Opens Both Ways. When Leora awoke, if waking was the right word, it wasn't because anything called her. There was no sound, no shift, no urgency. Only the feeling that the next part of the path had quietly, patiently uncurled while she slept. The glen was unchanged. Purple leaves still drifted slowly through the air, and the light remained a soft, perpetual twilight. Her lantern pulsed once in her palm, not a call, just a companionable nudge. She stood, stretched without hurry, and noticed that the glen had a new feature, now a narrow trail of flat stones leading through an archway made of twisting roots and bells made from old teacups. Each teacup chimed as she passed beneath it, notes of memory, fragments of emotion, a giggle, a sigh, the warmth of a hand once held too briefly. At the end of the trail stood a door. Not a gate, not an arch, but a real wooden door. It was tall and curved at the top, made of planks that shimmered faintly like wet leaves under moonlight. A gentle frame of ivy surrounded it, blooming with flowers that opened and closed slowly, as if they, too, were breathing. There was a message carved into the center of the door in flowing script. "This door opens both ways. Choose with your heart." Leora tilted her head. There was no knob, no latch, just the sense that the door would respond to intent. She placed her hand against the wood. Immediately, the wood warmed beneath her palm. The flowers rustled. The world grew still, not because it waited, but because it listened. Then the door opened. It swung inward and outward at the same time, a motion that didn't make sense, and yet felt perfectly right. Beyond it was not one place but two, overlapping, coexisting, waiting for her to walk through and become the thread between them. On one side, a memory of her cottage back home, the familiar creak of the stairs, the smell of tea steeping and rain on the windows. On the other, a vision of a place she had never been, but somehow always known, a great field of soft blue wheat, wind chimes in the trees, and someone waiting just out of sight. Leora smiled. The door hadn't asked her to pick one or the other. It had simply reminded her she was allowed to carry both. So she stepped through, not to escape, not to arrive, but to continue. The door closed behind her with a sound like a page being turned. Ahead, the hollow had changed again. The path wound through a forest painted in pale blues and grays, where every branch looked like it was drawn in charcoal and memory. The air had a new quiet to it, not deeper, just older. And once more her feet moved forward, carrying her not toward an end, but through another gentle unfolding. Part 18, The Inn That Never Moves. The charcoal-lined forest whispered gently around Leora as she walked, branches creaking like old friends stretching after a nap, leaves swaying in soft agreement. The path narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again, without ever asking her permission. The hollow moved as it pleased, and so did she. After a time that didn't measure in minutes or hours, but in heartbeats and hushes, Leora saw a light ahead. A warm one, yellow like butter melting into toast. It flickered from a row of windows built into the side of a small hill. A wooden sign hung lazily from an iron bracket. The Inn That Never Moves. For those between moments. Leora smiled as she approached. The front door was already cracked open. Inside, the inn was filled with the sort of quiet that comes after laughter, not before it. Tables were arranged in loose spirals, and a small hearth crackled lazily near the far wall. The firewood inside popped softly, releasing little glimmers of memory into the air. She caught glimpses of a tea party under a mushroom cap, a dragon folding laundry, a goblin dancing in socks far too large. A woman behind the counter looked up and gave a small nod. She had soft eyes and a braid that glowed faintly like moon thread. "You've arrived," she said, "but not to stay." "I wouldn't dream of it," Leora replied. "Good," the woman said, pouring a cup of something too soft to be called tea. "This place is for pausing, not stopping." Leora took the cup and sat by the fire. The warmth seeped through her bones, not like heat, but like belonging. Around her, other travelers dozed or sipped or murmured to companions only they could see. One chair near the hearth was empty, but looked used, as though someone had just stood up from it a moment before she entered. A cushion on it was still warm. She didn't sit in it. Instead, she watched the flames. Each flicker told a different story, not clearly, not linearly, but in emotional brushstrokes, a loss felt and soothed, a joy held and then released, a worry gently forgiven. She could have stayed longer, but when her cup was empty, the innkeeper appeared at her side, holding a scarf woven with tiny maps and names. "For the way ahead," she said, wrapping it gently around Leora's shoulders. It smelled like somewhere between pine needles and ink. Leora bowed in thanks. She left through a back door that hadn't been there when she entered, and emerged onto a gently rising path made of starlight-colored stone. She looked back once. The inn was gone, or perhaps it had simply returned to its stillness, hidden again until the next traveler arrived, needing a breath between stories. The scarf fluttered at her shoulders, catching a breeze that hadn't existed until just now. And so she walked on, lighter, softer, more whole. Part 19, the clock tower that ticked only at dusk. The scarf around Leora's shoulders warmed as the path rose gently into hills of soft earth and velvet-shadowed grass. The stones beneath her feet glowed faintly now, cool hues of blue and violet, as though touched by moonlight stored away in old jars. Above, the sky deepened to a richer indigo. Not night yet, just that lingering edge of dusk where the world hushes, waiting for stars to speak. Ahead, high on the next hill, stood a clock tower, but it was no ordinary tower. Its walls were covered in ivy and painted stars. Great brass gears turned slowly along the outside, creaking in a rhythm too slow to dance to, too steady to ignore. The face of the clock had no numbers, only phases of the moon in a ring. And the hands were made of glass, and they shimmered like water remembering how to freeze. As Leora approached, a deep, resonant tick echoed across the hilltop. Just once. A small door in the tower's base swung open with a sound like a cello exhaling. Inside, everything glowed with candlelight and memory. Walls of ticking devices lined the interior. Hourglasses filled with golden fog, pocket watches that whispered lullabies, sundials set with tiny mirrors. None of them agreed on the time. None seemed to mind. A tall man in robes that trailed like ink moved slowly through the room, dusting with a feather duster shaped like a cloud. "Welcome," he said without looking. "You've arrived precisely at dusk, the only time we measure." Leora tilted her head. "Only at dusk?" He nodded. "Dawn is for forgetting. Night is for dreaming. Day is for doing. But dusk is for remembering slowly." He gestured to a long bench near the central gearworks. "Sit if you'd like. Let something rise." Sat. The great gear above her turned with such patience, it felt like it might never stop. The lantern in her hand flickered once and then dimmed entirely, content to rest. As the tower ticked again, once more and no more, a vision drifted through her mind. A slow one, a soft one. It was her younger, sitting by a window with a book open and untouched, watching clouds drift past a tall tree. A single thought from that moment returned now, not in words but in feeling. This will matter later. She hadn't known what that meant back then, but now, here in a tower that only ticked at dusk, she did. It mattered because it had been still. It had been quiet. It had been hers. The man nodded once, as if reading her thoughts, and turned away. No more ticks came. The clock tower had said all it needed to. Leora stood and walked to the doorway. The scarf on her shoulders trailed slightly behind her, catching the fading light. Outside, the stars had begun to blink again, softly, cautiously, as if checking to make sure it was time. The path continued down the other side of the hill, wrapped now in silver grass and small moths that fluttered just above the ground like floating punctuation. And without a sound, Leora walked on. Part 20, the Lantern Orchard. The hill gave way to a low valley, and as Leora descended, the air shifted again. It carried a faint perfume of citrus and candle wax, of dust warmed by memory. The moths that had followed her now scattered, drifting up toward the stars like she'd released them from a page. At the bottom of the valley, the trees changed. They weren't quite like the trees of the forest or the grove or the garden. These stood taller, straighter, and bore no leaves. Instead, hanging from every branch were lanterns, hundreds, maybe thousands, each one glowing a different softness of light. Some flickered like quiet laughter. Others pulsed slowly like old lullabies. A few shimmered like the last moment before sleep claims a thought. A carved sign stood just before the orchard began. Lantern Orchard, light only what was never lost. Leora stepped between the trees. The light from each lantern responded to her differently. Some grew warmer as she passed, others cooled into a resting glow, and a few did nothing at all. She didn't feel watched, but she felt noticed, as if the orchard knew her, the way a favorite book knows its reader. Beneath one tree, a fox-shaped lantern swayed gently and cast shadows shaped like folded letters. She stood beside it for a moment, and the air filled with the sound of pages turning, not quickly, but deliberately. Another tree held a lantern shaped like a teacup. As she passed, it chimed once and filled the air with the scent of bergamot and bread. A small creature, a lantern tender perhaps, appeared from behind a trunk. It had mossy fur and moved with the grace of someone who'd spent many centuries being quiet. It offered her a lantern unlit, round, and made of woven silver reeds. "For your remembering," it said, and nothing more. She took it gently and carried it through the orchard. After several minutes, or perhaps hours, for time didn't stretch here, it curved. Leora came to the heart of the orchard. A clearing surrounded by the tallest trees, their branches holding lanterns so high they looked like stars that had wandered too low. At the center stood a table with no chairs, a small empty hook in its center. She hung the silver reed lantern there. At once it began to glow, not brightly, but with the kind of light one sees through closed eyelids. A light that lives behind a favorite story. A light that doesn't illuminate, but reassures. It hummed once, just once. That was enough. Leora stood still. Around her, the other lanterns began to pulse. not in unison, but in gentle rhythm, like a quiet applause for someone who hadn't asked for it. She bowed her head, not in pride but in peace. When she turned to leave, the orchard shifted slightly, allowing her to find the path again, not because she was done, but because the lanterns had given her back something she didn't know she'd misplaced. The night was deeper now, the hollow quieted around her, and the next step, as always, waited gently beneath her feet. Part 21, The Fairy of Forgotten Days. The path out of the lantern orchard wound gently downward, threading between low hedges that whispered like paper being folded. The lanterns behind Leora glowed a little longer, then dimmed in soft unison, their light lingering in the corners of her mind like the final notes of a lullaby. She walked in silence until she reached the edge of a wide, dark river. It didn't rush, it didn't ripple, it simply moved, slow and steady, like time after everyone has stopped looking at the clock. At the riverbank, a wooden dock stretched out into the water. Tied loosely to its end floated a ferry, flat-bottomed, lantern-lit, and unmanned. A sign beside it read, "For crossings that do not need to be remembered." There were no instructions. No fare, no oars. Leora stepped aboard and the boat began to glide. The lanterns at each corner flickered gently, casting soft reflections onto the river's surface. But those reflections didn't show her. They showed different things: a window open to the scent of summer rain, a coat forgotten on a cafe chair, the quiet click of a closing door she hadn't realized she missed. All the little days that had passed, without ceremony. Not bad days, not even sad ones. Just small. The river welcomed them. As the ferry drifted onward, a low hum began to rise. Not a song exactly, but the echo of the days she'd once lived without holding on to. They were there now, resting in the water, in the air, in the gentle creak of the boat's frame. About halfway across, the mist rose, not thick, just enough to blur the edges of the world. It gave everything permission to let go. A memory came, quiet and clear, a time she had once waited for someone who never arrived. The ache of it had faded long ago, but the ghost of the waiting had lingered. Now it simply floated past her on the current, acknowledged, accepted, and released. The boat bumped softly against the far bank, and the mist thinned. A willow stood beside the landing, its limbs swaying despite the still air. Tied to one of its branches was a length of white ribbon. As Leora stepped ashore, the ribbon untied itself and drifted down into her hands. Embroidered in faint thread was a phrase. Nothing was wasted. She folded the ribbon gently and placed it in the pocket beside the pebble, beside the button, beside the quiet she'd gathered along the way. The river behind her was already fading, not vanishing, just drifting away like everything else the hollow knew how to hold and let go of. The path ahead curled upward, just slightly, as though it had taken a long breath and was ready to exhale again. So Leora walked on. Part 22, The Shelf Beneath the Sky. The path climbed gently now over small ridges covered in pillow moss and beneath arches of trees that had long stopped trying to grow and had settled instead into a state of restful watching. The air grew thinner, not colder, but more spacious, like a room filled with breath. Eventually, the trees gave way, and Leora found herself on a high plateau, flat, wide, open to everything. It felt like she had stepped into the sky itself. Across the plateau stood a long wooden shelf, stretching from one horizon to the other. It had no supports, no wall to rest against. It simply was. Each cubby held a different object, delicately placed, clearly loved, gently left behind. One held a faded pair of gloves, another a music box with no key, a stone shaped like a question, a bell that didn't ring, a single shoelace still knotted, a photograph where the faces had drifted away, leaving only the setting sun. Above the shelf, carved into the air itself, were these words: "For what we carried longer than we needed to." Leora stepped forward, the scarf around her shoulders catching a sudden breeze, soft and understanding. She walked along the shelf, each item sparking something quiet within her. Small stories, feelings without anchors, people who had once passed briefly through her orbit, leaving a shape behind. Then at the center of the shelf, she saw an empty space. Just one. Not large, not marked. But waiting. She reached into her lantern's satchel. The ribbon, the button, the pebble. She held each one in her palm for a long time, considering. Then gently, almost without realizing, she set down the ribbon, the one that whispered, nothing was wasted. She didn't need to carry the proof anymore. The ribbon folded itself neatly and rested in the space. The shelf gave a low creak, gratitude, not burden. Leora stepped back. The sky above deepened to soft plum. Stars scattered across it like seeds on velvet. Behind her, the path unfurled again. Not with urgency, with invitation. She looked at the shelf one last time, eyes soft, heart steady. And then she continued, lighter again, though she hadn't noticed the weight until it was gone. Part 23, the Sleepwell Crossing. The stars followed her now, not above her, but around her. As Leora left the plateau, they drifted slowly through the air like soft embers, never touching, always nearby. The path wound through a low stretch of meadows where tall grasses swayed in sync with her breath. She felt calm, not from rest exactly, but from having walked through so many layers of quiet. Then she heard it. Not footsteps, not wind, just a rhythm. Soft, slow, the sound of water lapping gently against something solid. Ahead, the meadow gave way to a wide stretch of marsh, and beyond that, a bridge. But not just any bridge. This one was made of woven reeds and dreamwood, lit from beneath by lanterns that floated inside glass orbs, drifting along just under the surface of the water. At its entrance stood a tall archway wrapped in trailing ivy and ribbons. A sign swayed gently overhead. Sleepwell Crossing for those who have come far enough. Leora stepped onto the bridge. With every step, a new sound joined the quiet, the creak of wood that remembered lullabies, the splash of memories dipping their toes back into sleep, the exhale of something long held finally being released. Halfway across, she paused. Not from uncertainty, but because the view here was too quiet to rush. The water below was black, glassy still, but within it swam hundreds of glowing shapes, fish, birds, boats, names, shifting and melting into each other like the slow motion of dreams. She leaned slightly over the edge, watching as one shape floated beneath her feet, a bed, gently rocking, with no one in it, and pillows puffed like clouds. Another, a quill that wrote on its own, the ink forming circles instead of words. And another, a tiny version of herself, curled up peacefully asleep beneath a tree that bloomed stars. The shapes passed. And then the other side of the bridge. A small sign there, barely carved, read, "You are no longer walking forward. You are walking in." Leora touched it gently as she passed. The ground changed again, no longer a path, but a soft surface, like woven blankets left out under starlight. The lantern in her palm glowed one last time, then dimmed completely, curling in on itself like a cat in sleep. And she let it. The hollow didn't disappear. It folded closer. Around her. Within her. Still guiding, still breathing. But now it was quiet. Part 24, the room without walls. Past Sleepwell Crossing, the hollow softened even further. The starlight no longer floated above Leora's head. It drifted within her steps, lighting the ground in quiet pulses that responded to her breathing. The path had dissolved completely, and yet she knew where to go. She moved without thinking, like a leaf carried on water, like a thought that didn't need forming. She wasn't lost. She simply wasn't concerned with arrival anymore. And then she reached it, not a clearing, not a home, not an end, but a space, open, gentle, waiting, a room without walls. There was no roof, no floor, just a sense of enclosure, held together by something deeper than wood or stone. It felt like the inside of a thought she hadn't yet spoken aloud. It felt like belonging. In the center of the space was a low platform, shaped like a nest made of woven sighs and lullabies. A pillow rested there, and a folded quilt embroidered with stars that blinked when she looked away. And beside the nest, a journal. It was bound in soft leather, the kind that had grown kind from being touched. A small note lay tucked beneath it. "When you are ready, write what you do not need to keep." Leora sat down beside it. She didn't open the book right away. She simply placed her hands over it, feeling the hum of all the stories inside, unfinished, unspoken, unneeded. Then she wrote. Not for long. Not with urgency. She wrote a shape, a memory, a thought too heavy to carry. And when she closed the book, it sighed gently and shimmered, then turned to mist and drifted into the stars. The quilt curled up into her arms without effort. The nest-shaped platform exhaled as she lay back into it. Her body sank as if it had always belonged there. And as she lay under the starlight, she felt herself dissolve, not disappear, but blend. Into hush. Into hollow. Into rest. The room without walls did not vanish. It became her, and she became it. And far above, though she no longer needed to look, stars turned their slow and gentle circles, never rushing, never blinking too fast. Part 25, The Gentle Unfolding. Leora did not know how long she lay in the nest of starlit thread and memory. Time was no longer something to be tracked. It had become something that lived beside her, like a sleepy pet curled at her side, breathing, stretching, concerned. Her eyes were closed, but she saw everything. The hollow did not fade. It flowed. Scenes passed like water around her, the fox-shaped bench, the stitched cottage, the mirror that forgot to reflect. Each place returned not to remind, but to rest beside her, like companions who needed no conversation. Every memory she thought she'd left behind was here, but quieter, softer, dream-warmed. Above, the sky began to brighten, not with morning, but with meaning. A silver blue spread slowly, like light had remembered how to paint again. Something tugged at the edge of her mind. Not a voice, not a word, just readiness. She opened her eyes. The hollow had rearranged itself again. Where the room without walls had once been, there now stood a hallway of woven branches and gentle wind. It beckoned, not forward, not back, but onward. She stood. The scarf around her shoulders adjusted itself. The button in her pocket hummed once as if to say, still here. The pebble was warm again. The lantern, long since dark, hung quietly at her hip, no longer needed to lead the way, only to remember where she'd been. She began walking. The hallway did not end. It unfolded. Petals underfoot, birdsong above, air full of gentle things. She passed through a curtain of mist that kissed her cheeks like old joy, through a ring of stones that spun ever so slightly, through an archway that whispered welcome without sound. The hollow had not ended. She had begun again. Not a different person, just a quieter one. At the final turn of the path, she came to a gate. It was simple, woven from driftwood and wind, tied with threads from all the places she'd walked. It had no lock, no test, just a question carved into the top. Will you carry your quiet with you? Leora did not answer with words. She stepped through. Part 26, The Threshold of Return. On the other side of the gate, the hollow did not vanish. It softened. The trees stood a little farther apart. The light took on the golden blush of something remembered fondly. Birds sang now, not songs with tunes, but notes of presence, of continuation. The path beneath Leora's feet felt different too, not because it had changed, but because she had. She noticed each step, not in thought, but in feeling. The way her heel touched down, the way the air moved around her shoulders. Even the silence between footfalls felt like part of a larger, slower rhythm. She passed a sign with no text, only a carving a spiral, looping inward and outward at once. A small child sat beside it, legs tucked under, drawing in the dirt with a stick. They looked up at Leora, smiled, and said nothing. She smiled back and walked on. Soon, the forest gave way to a field of tall grass, each blade tipped in soft white fluff, like dandelions waiting to remember what they once wished for. The wind moved gently through them, and in its breath she heard the echo of her own steps from long ago. And then finally she saw it. The cottage. Her cottage. Tucked into the base of a hill just where she'd left it, or perhaps just where it had waited to reappear. The windows were open. Curtains fluttered like hands waving, and from the chimney a single curl of smoke rose into the quiet sky. No fanfare, no bright ending, just a return. She walked the final few paces with her eyes half closed. At the door she paused. Tucked into the corner of the porch, beside the doormat shaped like a moon, was a note tied with blue string. She opened it. You never left. You only wandered into yourself. Welcome home. She placed the note in her pocket. And with the quiet of someone who has finally remembered how to rest, Leora opened the door and stepped inside. Part 27, The End That Sleeps. The door closed behind her with the softest click, like the final period at the end of a well-loved book. Inside the cottage, everything was as she remembered it. Not because it had been preserved, but because it had always been part of her. The teapot on the stove hummed a low, contented tune. The pillows on the chair were arranged just slightly differently than she might have placed them herself. A single lantern, her lantern, rested on the windowsill, flickering not with light but with breath. She ran a finger across the edge of the table, its wood smooth with time and tea. The shelves still held the books she hadn't opened in years. Or maybe ever. They didn't ask to be read. They just wanted to be near. She walked into the small bedroom, where the quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed and the sheets were cool and quiet. A window above the bed framed a stretch of night sky where the stars now blinked slowly, less like distant fires and more like old friends who'd finally found their way home, too. She sat at the edge of the bed and took off her shoes. Each one gave a soft sigh, like they, too, were ready to rest. From her pocket, she laid out what remained. The pebble, the button, the scarf, the note, the quiet. She placed them each in a small wooden box by the bed. She did not seal it. Some things are meant to be kept open, even in rest. Leora lay back against the pillows. Outside, the hollow still turned gently. She could feel it, not calling her, not waiting, just existing, somewhere inside her chest now, where it would always unfold whenever her feet itched for softness again. She pulled the quilt over her, and the fabric welcomed her, like dusk itself. Her breath slowed. Her shoulders sank. The hollow whispered a final word, one she did not hear with ears, but with every quiet part of herself that had once longed to be still. And then she slept, not because she was tired, but because she was finally, deeply wonderfully, home. Thank you for walking with us through the 1,000 steps of Windfern Hallow. Whether you're still listening or already drifting far beyond the last path, know that you are safe, you are welcome, and you are not alone. If this story brought you rest, peace, or even just a little more quiet, feel free to return anytime. The Hallow will always be here, waiting gently, never in a hurry. Please consider liking or subscribing if you'd like more slow stories for Restless Minds. Until next time, sleep deeply and dream well. End of the 1,000 Steps of Winfern.